Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the US had a multi-party system. We all know the US and their political system is very specific. The US president has a lot of power, and we could actually say that the whole system is a very presidential one. The parties in the US don't really have much power except for two parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party. I would, however, not qualify them as a party per se, but more of a political platform. If we are checking the pre-election season in the US, then we see that many people from multiple ideologies and with multiple ideas, they compete for the ticket of becoming the presidential candidate of the Republican or the Democratic Party. It used to be very common for certain people even to switch parties from Republican to Democrat or vice versa. However, in the recent years, both parties radicalized in some way or another, and thus they distanced themselves from each other. I'm not making a personal evaluation, I'm just stating the obvious in here. I mean, come on, the Democrats and the Republicans, they are really far from each other nowadays. Sure, there are also different parties within the US, but the only time where a third candidate, at least in the recent years, has gathered many votes was Ross Perot with over 18%. But then again, he was an independent politician, and he didn't belong to a party. Another time where a party other than the Democrats or Republicans within the US got a lot of votes and even had the governor of a state was the Alaskan Independence Party. This was also in the 90s. The reason was that the Republican candidate switched to the Alaskan Independence Party and the electors voted for him, and not because of the Alaskan Independence Party program. Overall, we can say that these two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, they are so ingrained within the US political landscape that only when a somewhat established candidate switches from one party to another, then this candidate can actually get some votes, and so can then a third party. The only time where the US saw even 4 presidential candidates from 4 different parties gathering over 5% was in 1912, over 100 years ago. But what if all of that changed? What if the US had a multi-party system? In this alternate history, I'm not going to propose a point of divergence, but I will discuss how such an alternate US could look like, especially the parties. Let's say that for whatever reason, the election of 1912 would become so ingrained and so crucial in the US culture that after that point, we would see more elections with more candidates and more parties joining the rally. We may even get an alternate US in which a second term would become as normal as in other countries, for instance, such as France, for instance. I'm not saying that the French system is identical, but there are some similarities, and I think an alternate US with a multi-party system could resemble the French system a little bit, with the key difference, of course, being that the US won't have a prime minister. The US would never change how their system works because they consider George Washington almost sacred, as well as the decisions that have been implemented by their founding fathers. So it would be something very huge to suddenly change all of that. However, adjustments to the election of the president, well, this could be made because you always need some votes of specific states to be even able to have a majority behind you. And once you fail to get so many electors behind you, then, well, a new election has to be made, or a second election. In this alternate 1912, we could have a strong Democratic, Republican, Progressive, and Socialist Party. The strength of the Socialist Party would, however, due to the paranoia of communism, not be that strong, and it may even decline. This doesn't mean that it will totally disappear or be wiped out, but it is entirely possible that in this alternate US, rather than like merging with the Republicans or switching to the Democrats, the Progressive Party may even take some members of the Socialist Party, and it could become something similar to a Social Democratic Party like in Germany or the Labour Party in the UK, for instance. Sure, we will also see some communist parties rising and other extreme left parties, but due to the fear of communism, I don't think that any extreme left party will fare well. Let's take a look at the Democratic Party. Nowadays, there is a tendency to have more left-wing factions in the Democratic Party, but there are also more moderate factions. There is also a libertarian faction, a fiscally conservative faction, a liberal faction, and, well, the so-called progressive faction, and of course the left-wing faction. Of course, in this alternate US with multiple parties, we will not have these many factions within the Democratic Party. And to better understand which factions would form their own parties, we need to also take a look at the Republicans as well. And in there we have, for instance, the Trumpist faction, Christian faction, Libertarian faction as well, neoconservative faction, paleoconservative faction, traditionalists, moderates, business conservatives, and so on. We already have a left-wing party with the Progressive Socialist Party, which for the sake of this scenario we may just continue calling the Progressive Party. In there, some moderates of the Republican Party and a good chunk of the Democratic Party would find a political home. The Southern Democrats in such a timeline would become a strong regional force. Sometimes they may even become something like a kinsmaker, if there would be a second term. Then the Southern Democratic Party, they would become very important. Moreover, we would also get over time a libertarian party, a party that actually has the program of libertarianism. They wouldn't care so much for social issues, but they would care a lot for business, capitalism, and free markets. Perhaps also the democratization of the world would be their main thing. A Catholic party may also come into existence, as well as other Christian parties such as a Protestant party, but these parties, they would after a certain time come together, maybe merge, fuse, or at least collaborate, just like in Germany, for instance, with the CDU-CSU. Then we would also get other parties that would advocate for the rights of certain minorities, maybe even a moderate black rights party, and a reaction to that could lead to a, well, more far-right white party. Maybe even a nationalist party could then exist, which should not be that much on the far right than a far-right white party. The remaining Republican Party would be somewhere between the Christian parties, the Libertarian Party, and the Nationalist Party. And over the time, I think that Southern Democrats, they may actually join other parties depending on how extreme they are, or they may even split, or they could just continue existing but become irrelevant over time. The issue of the environment becomes very important, even nowadays. And this was also the case especially in the 80s. And I think that just like in OTL, we may also see something like a Green Party emerging, which would stand between the Progressive Party and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party would be more centrist in this alternate timeline, while the Republican Party, they would still side a little bit to the right, but they would not be as much to the right as they are in our timeline. And also due to the concurrence that it has from other similar parties, it's even possible that the Republican Party could be gone in the next few years. After the Cold War, and assuming everything happens as in OTL, a left-wing party would certainly also arise and position itself very much to the left. The Christian party could have a similar evolution as in Europe, where it would over time become more and more moderate and actually become closer to the Democrats and be somewhere in the political center. The Christian party may, if successful, even become the most supported party by the Latinos, for instance, because a huge majority of the Latinos, they are still very Catholic. While minority issues, especially of black people, would remain important, and in the political discussion, purely minority parties, they would fade to exist within the next 20-30 years in this alternate timeline. In an alternate 2022, we may see from the left to the right a left party, the Progressive Party, Green Party, the Democratic Party, Christian Party, Libertarian Party, Republican Party, and the Nationalist Party as federal parties. And then we would also have many regional parties or even single issues parties which could shake the elections every now and then. We may even see big alliances, huge lists, or we may see the contrary, and every party would do their own thing. Maybe even the issue of state rights could see a comeback, because some states they would feel that they have no real representation, or the discussion about the stronger federal government could be led. I honestly don't know what the consequences would be, and I think that history would change too much with a US that would have a multi-party system. But then again, this is more a thought experiment and not a real alternate history, I would say. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.